Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another session of Indiana's MTSS Virtual Sharing and Learning Community. This community is provided in collaboration with the Indiana Department of Education, the Indiana IEP Resource Center. My name is Marcy Wilburn, and I'm the project coordinator for the Indiana IEP Resource Center. We are glad that you're able to join us this afternoon. The focus of today's session will be on the last two domains highlighted in our MTSS in Motion series, communication and collaboration, and multi-tiered instruction and intervention. Throughout the session, we encourage you to contribute to the conversation and pose questions. In order to do so, there are two options. For those of you who haven't participated before, you can either type in the chat box or use your mic. The chat box is located at the bottom right of the screen. You simply type your message and click send. At this time, all of your mics have been muted. So in order to use your mic, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon above the chat box, and your mic will be unmuted so that you can begin to share your comments. At this time, I'd like to get to know who's participating. So if you could please enter in the chat box your role in the district that you're with. And then also if you could enter in if you're participating with anybody else. We would like to get a good idea of who is participating in today's session and the true number. So if you have a group of 2 or even more, if you could put that number in the chat box, we would appreciate it. We have a school psych. What other roles do we have that are participating today? So Elizabeth, what's your role? Tracy and her long title. All right, couple behavior consultants. Perfect. All right, thank you. All right, to start us off, I just want to know a little bit about where you're at or where your district or building is at in the implementation of MTSS. So if you have no implementation started whatsoever and you're just really in that learning phase of gathering the information, put a 0 in the chat box. If you feel as if your district and or building's in the beginning stages of implementation, really looking at emerging and developing, you're kind of preparing the system for the MTSS implementation, developing common language, really looking at training staff on what MTSS is, maybe expanding from academics to broaden that to social emotional learning and behavior as well. Put a 1 in the chat box. Put a 2 in the chat box if you're more of that upper stage. You're making progress in each of the areas for the domains, but you really haven't been doing it long enough to make huge strides, but you're able to see some improvement over time in the areas that you've learned about. And the last one would be you feel like you're fully implemented. 65% of your buildings are on board and you have worked in each area of the domain. So everybody's really at that beginning stage. Wonderful. All right. So you have gone through and you have really looked at leadership and capacity building infrastructure already in the first session. And then in the last session, Patrick took you through both of the data domains, so problem-solving process and data evaluation. So today we're going to focus on communication and collaboration and multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. I hope that you were all able to view the short videos prior to the session. I apologize for sending those out so late. I thought I had sent the email and had not, so I'm sorry for the late notice on that. But with them being so short, I was hoping that you would be able to watch them. If not, we will go over some of that information today, and then we'll really expand upon answering some questions around where you are and if you have any additional questions for us in each of these domains. So when we talk about the domains, these are 6 effective practices for improving student outcomes. So these practices describe an evidence model of educating students, and we're really looking at the integration of academics, behavior, and social and emotional instruction in order to maximize the success for all students. So we look at the data. We determine what instruction is best to meet the needs of our learners and what interventions are going to help them in areas that they need to improve upon. We want to make sure that we're meeting their needs. And I think it's important that the system is flexible. This is a framework. It's nothing that we have to stick to maintain. So if students move to different tiers, they can move out, and it's just for certain areas. It doesn't have to be we're a tier 2 kid or we're a tier 3 kid. We're really moving away from that and really looking at the whole child and what their needs are to develop their instruction and interventions. So we're going to start out by really looking at communication and collaboration. And with that section, we're going to talk a little bit more. Let me get through these slides. We're going to talk about staff having consensus and engaging in MTSS implementation. So we have to recognize that, like with all initiatives, when we're looking at the MTSS framework, we need to start out with that staff buy-in. We have to engage our leaders. We need to find those cheerleaders within our system who can help us sell this to other individuals. And sometimes it's important to figure out who those influential naysayers are, or the people who, maybe don't think this is the best for the system, and how can we get them on board and then help them sell to others. So finding those positive people and those people who you really need to target who are considered leaders within the system to help you sell this to other individuals. You need to develop a knowledge base within your system. You need to determine what MTSS means for your school or your district, and then train that out to the individuals within your system. Develop that common language and common understanding so that people know exactly what the expectation is for them. Define opportunities for all staff to engage in the work. Sometimes you have to define what roles will be, or even redefine roles. Sometimes within an MTSS system, some of your standard job descriptions no longer fit. You are determining the best match for those students, and sometimes that doesn't always align with the job descriptions that we have already in place. So you have to look at that. We have to look at each member of our staff as a valued member, and how can they help us to meet the needs of all of the learners within our system. So discuss the importance of that shared responsibility. It definitely takes a village, and one individual within the system is not going to be able to help students meet their full potential. The next step is staff are provided with data on MTSS implementation, fidelity, and student outcomes. You really have to have a good sense of the why of the work, and staff need to understand why they're putting forth this effort and why they're doing things the way they are within an MTSS framework. So when they're showing the data and they can see that you're making strides not only in MTSS implementation, but also in student outcomes. So you're really looking at the fidelity of MTSS implementation and how you're improving through each domain. And with that, there's a positive correlation. The longer that you implement MTSS, student outcomes improve over time. So you have to determine where your school or district is in that process and show people that, look, here's the data to show that your hard work is paying off. What are those gains? And then you have to also discuss the infrastructure that exists to support the school's goals for family and community engagement in MTSS. So like we talked about earlier, it's definitely a shared responsibility. So how are you engaging the family members to support with some of these domains? Are there opportunities for meaningful participation from both family and community members? And what are these opportunities with your school and or district? Are there community nights? Are members of the community or parents serving on committees and or leadership teams to help make some of those decisions within the system? And then educators need to actively engage families in MTSS. So parents need to understand when students are moving in and out of tiers and what that means and why we're doing what we're doing, to understand how to support them, and that we're really looking at the needs of their student or their child and how we can help them progress. So now that we've talked a little bit more about communication and collaboration within the system, I want to dive into some questions. But one thing before we do that is the communication piece. Sometimes it's important to have a communication plan in place, which buildings have communication ideas. So they want, teachers to send out newsletters to parents, or they want the district to, post on their Facebook page or have information available, but if you have it in a plan, then it's more apt to get finished and it's more apt to be scheduled. So focus on each of the key stakeholder groups. Parents would be one, community members would be one, but also if you're at a district level, think about your teachers and how we're going to communicate to them. If you're at a building level, think how you're going to communicate from building principals down to teachers as well. And you have to determine what information will be shared with those individuals, who's responsible for sharing that information, and then making sure that, you know, is it timely? When is that information going to be shared? So really mapping that out for all of your key stakeholders to ensure that that communication takes place. This will improve that buy-in over time and let people have an understanding of what their role is in the process. So now moving on to the questions. And this is where I would love it if you would participate in the chat window and provide some information on, you know, what really is taking place within your district. So what is your role in MTSS implementation within your school or district? So we have some school psychs on here and some behavior consultants. As you are beginning the work, what has your role morphed into, or what is it from the beginning? So looking at our behavior consultants, are you really looking at adding that behavioral component and social emotional learning component to maybe what is already existing within your district for academics? Or do you have some of that in place already? All right, let's look at our leadership team meetings. How often are you working with other team members at either district level or building level to discuss MTSS implementation since this is in your early stages? Or are you even at that point yet? Oh, it looks like I missed some of the chat. So Jennifer says, helping to define what tools can be used to make database decisions. Tracy's the team member who's helping with school and student discussions, also meeting with specific students for related reasons, so maybe some of that tier 3 type of support. Lynn serving on the district-wide leadership team. Elizabeth's working in self-contained classrooms in 2 schools. Okay, so you bring a different perspective. Leadership team meetings are weekly, every Friday morning. Wonderful. And Tracy, that is at a co-op level, correct? Or are you within buildings and schools? School-based. Okay, wonderful. And then it looks like there's some, let's go back up to some district-wide team meetings as well, monthly. And these are just to plan the early stages of implementation. Great. So making sure that as you're having these meetings, how are you communicating the results of the meetings out to the stakeholders that it's important to make sure that they have the information in a timely manner is always beneficial. So the next question is, within our district or building, what has led to successful implementation and what has led to failed initiatives? in your district outside of MTSS, what are the things that have made you successful, and what are the things that you look back on and think, well, we tried to put that in place, but it didn't stick. Why do you think that it didn't stick? Lack of consistency and purpose. So that brings us back to our why. People need to know why they're doing it. That's the purpose behind it. I think at times we overwhelm our system and we look at all these initiatives and people don't see how they can possibly do one more thing. And it's important when we communicate the message in MTSS that it really isn't intended to be one more thing. The goal of MTSS is really to look at this framework, and it is a framework that all of the things that we're doing fit into, and how can we determine how they are integrated across the framework so that we're not doing new things over and over again. It's really how can we organize what we're doing and work smarter, not harder. Let's look at the next question. How does our district and/or building engage family and community partners? So what are you currently doing for our family and community partners? Okay, so we have some individuals who, are not really sure what's taking place to engage family and community partners. So these questions can also be used at your weekly and or monthly leadership team meetings when you're talking about each domain to kind of brainstorm what is taking place and let you see what are the areas that you have initiatives in place for, and what are some things that you maybe need to look at to improve upon. Some people aren't there yet. They're just writing grants to obtain funds in order to do so. But family and community engagement, especially that family piece and that parent piece, is a great predictor of student growth. So how can we make sure that we're engaging families and helping them feel a part of that school community? So great. It sounds like that is something that will be worked upon. Tracy said that one of our schools recently started a brochure that gets mailed to all residents of Spencer County, not just parents of students. Very informative and tells the community what is going on in the school systems. Yes, I think that's great. So then you're reaching those community partners as well. Again, when something is, you have kind of a system around when items are going to go out and who's responsible for it, then we're ensuring that that communication is taking place. And it can be as small as communicating out what's happening at a district leadership team meeting, or like what Tracy's saying, a mailer that's going out to the entire county. So it's thinking about that and planning that communication that goes out to everyone. Something to consider when you're starting the work, because even the early stages of the work needs to be communicated. And then the last question, describe one way district or building staff are able to really look at the initiatives that are taking place, provide input on the initiatives. So several of you are serving on district leadership team meetings, but how are you making sure that other individuals who don't have a voice at the table are able to provide input on those initiatives? Or is there a process for that? Oh, yes. The question is, describe one way that individuals who maybe aren't on your leadership team meeting are able to provide input on initiatives that are taking place within your district. How are you gauging the rest of the school? Monthly meetings with larger team involving reps from all buildings. Great. I think something that is done in a lot of the buildings that we work in is, surveys to staff to determine what maybe their area of need for training is, or what their level of knowledge is, or even their belief system. Do they feel like all kids can learn? And so you can, survey individuals as well to get sometimes anonymous, sometimes not, but to have an understanding of where people are within your system. But really allowing them to feel like their voice can be heard is important. Alrighty. I just checked the time and noticed we have 10 minutes left for multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. So I apologize. We will speed through this one, and if you have questions, let me know. So looking at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, several of you are already familiar with the triangle, but we're really looking within an MTSS framework at academics, behavioral, and social emotional practices. So when we talk about the importance of an integrated model, we're just think about it as every academic task demand that we're asking students to do within a classroom. We have to understand that there's also an emotional response to that, and that's that social emotional learning component. And then there's a related action, which is the behavior. So when we're talking about this, all of these things are interrelated, and they really can't be looked at in silos because it's all taking place within the same classroom at the same time with the students. So they're being asked to do something, and then they have a response to that, and then they act on that response. We talk a lot about when we're looking at whether a reading intervention is helpful or not. Is it because the student is missing part of core instruction because he's tardy every day? So you have to look at the big picture. You can't just look at academics in a silo. Is behavior the reason that the student's struggling with reading? Because he's acting out and his place in the hall or is sent out, and so he's not really receiving the instruction. Is it that he's acting out behaviorally because school is hard for him and it's easier to act out and get sent out than to look like he's stupid or doesn't know the information? So it's all interrelated when we look at academics, social emotional learning, and behavior. So when we look at the framework for each of the tiers, we really start out with that Tier 1 and recognizing that Tier 1 is the core and it's impacting all students. And so if you don't have good Tier 1 instruction, if 80% of your kids are not successful on their benchmarks for academics, behavior, and social emotional learning, that's where you start. You really focus on Tier 1 until it's working for the majority of your students. Tier 1 is that first best instruction, carefully selected to meet the needs of the students that you're serving. So really looking at what instruction best meets the population of students that we have within our building. It's really providing universal supports for all students that are evidence-based, that are meeting the students within the building. Designing Tier 1 always starts with the question, what do we expect all students to learn, and how will we know if they've learned it? So determining that. And again, you can't intervene your way out of poor Tier 1 instruction. So if you have kids who aren't successful, then really looking at the focusing the efforts on improving Tier 1 instruction. Then you look at that Tier 2 for some of the students. So Tier 1 is what are we doing for all, and Tier 2 is what are we doing for some students. Tier 2 instruction intervention is supplemental to Tier 1 and is provided to groups of students that are not meeting academic, behavioral, or social emotional benchmarks. Tier 2 support are only provided in targeted areas, and this is what we talked about. You're not that Tier 2 student. It's only the areas that you have deficits in, and once you've mastered that, moving out of Tier 2. It's not something you need to stay in just because you were placed in there when you were having difficulty with, one area. Tier 2 for supports maybe in math problem solving, but you don't need it in any of the other areas. You don't need it in necessarily computation. You have that down. It's just the problem solving piece. So looking at the individual skills and determining if people need it or not. All right, Elizabeth, some of the schools I work in do PBIS and teach Tier 1 to all students. Exactly. If we can, put PBIS in place and lay out the expectations for all students, and just like some of our supports that we have in buildings and what we're able to, provide to students, providing certain accommodations to all students can really help everyone. Providing visuals in the classroom can really help any of them. Elizabeth said that many of her schools do check-in and check-out for Tier 2, which is a wonderful evidence-based practice for behavior. Tracy says, I really think this is where a lot fails. We don't often look hard enough into Tier 1 and then think that all will be fixed if students are placed for services and get special supports in Tier 2 and 3. That's exactly what we keep preaching, is that if you don't have good Tier 1 and the instruction is not meeting the needs of learners in your Tier 1 instruction, then don't focus on your interventions. And really, you can look at your outcome data for all of your kids in your building, look at your benchmark data to determine whether Tier 1 needs to be your focus or whether you can start looking at Tier 2 or Tier 3. And with 5 minutes to go, Tier 3 is what we are doing for a few students. So it's that supplemental piece, but remember, it's supplemental to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports. So it's much more intensive, sometimes small groups, sometimes even individualized to meet the learner needs. And it's important that we're looking at data much more frequently. So in Tier 2, we move from benchmarking data to looking at data in the area of need monthly, and then in Tier 3, we're going as frequent as weekly to look at that progress monitoring data. It's important within this domain that school teams regularly examine the effectiveness of the practices at each tier and make adjustments based on the data. So again, in and out, you don't have to stay within a tier for the entire year or the entire semester. And please know that more specific information about each tier can be found in other MTSS and motion segments. So we have additional segments that includes Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and educating the whole child. So those ones that we didn't get into in this Communities of Practice but are available to you just by clicking the link to the entire MTSS and motion series, and you can look at those as well if that's of interest to you. I am going to skip through these questions so that we can go to the end. However, just really quickly, noting that these questions could be used within your meetings as well to determine kind of where you could put more of your effort and time, and use data to make those decisions, to determine, what you have in each of these areas. Sometimes we talk about really looking at resource inventories. What do you have for academics? What do you have for behavior? What do you have for social emotional learning to provide some of those interventions, and really targeting them like these are the things we're providing to everyone. These are some of the things that we're going to look at for Tier 2 or students who need additional support in these areas, and kind of having a menu selection for people to look at. If this is a deficit area, this is an intervention that could assist in that area. So resource inventories are really helpful when you're determining what a district's needs are to meet the needs of all learners. And finally, I just wanted to let you know about some additional professional learning opportunities because this is our last session of the Communities of Practice for the year. Again, we have additional videos in the MTSS in Motion series. We have a training January 8th that's titled Addressing the Needs of All Students Using Multi-Tiered System of Support. And this is an open catalog training that is free. So if you have individuals maybe on your leadership team that would like to know more about MTSS, this is a full day training. So this would be a good place to send people. If you have maybe, not maybe on your team, but individuals in your building who might be some of those leaders that you want to work with first and initially when we're talking about MTSS, maybe sending them to this training. You can sign up for that training on our website under workshops. And then the last thing that's coming up, our Focus on Inclusion Conference, for those of you who are not familiar, we have national experts in the field coming to present, and many of their sessions will focus on MTSS. So that's another area where you can get additional information, and that is March 11th and 12th. Registration for that we hope to have up towards the end of November, early December at the latest, so that you're able to register for that conference. There is a charge for that conference. This year it's going to be $250 for registration. However, that is 2 days of a conference with breakfast and lunch provided. So it's not that bad when you consider what you're getting, and you also get some resources and books too. Are there any questions before we end today's session? All right. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate it. And if we can support you in your implementation, please don't hesitate to contact us. Have a good evening.